The February wind of 1943 swept over the snow-covered roofs of Kharkov, howling through the empty window openings of the ruined state industry building. On the enormous Dzerzhinsky Square, the largest in Europe, silence had reigned until recently, broken only by the rare crunch of snow under the boots of patrols. But on this day, the air vibrated with a different sound, the growing roar of Soviet tank engines. Soldiers in faded camouflage smocks, their faces covered with soot and hoarfrost, entered the city with a feeling that could not be mistaken for anything else. It was an intoxicating sensation of final, irreversible triumph. It seemed that the enemy's spine had been definitively broken there, in the Stalingrad steppes, and now nothing could stop this mighty westward movement. Commanders, thrilled with delight, marked new settlements on their maps, and in the headquarters, they were already whispering that they would meet the spring of this year on the banks of the Dnieper, and perhaps even much further. At this moment, none of them, from private to marshal, could have imagined that behind this dazzling victory lay the most cunning trap ever set on the fields of great battles. The euphoria of that time had every reason to exist. Paulus's Sixth Army had ceased to exist, and this event became a tectonic shift in the consciousness of both sides. For the Soviet leadership, the fall of Kharkov on February 16, 1943, seemed not just a tactical success, but the beginning of the final act. The Supreme High Command in Moscow, emboldened by the success of Operation Ring, demanded a continuation of the banquet. Plans codenamed Star and Leap set truly grandiose tasks for the troops, not just to liberate the industrial Donbass, but to cut off the entire southern grouping of the enemy, pinning it against the Azov Sea. The confidence that the enemy was fleeing in panic was so absolute that any intelligence data indicating the concentration of fresh enemy forces was perceived as annoying interference or attempts at rearguard cover for a retreat. Marshal Philip Golikov and General Nikolai Vatutin, who were at the forefront of this offensive, literally drove their corps forward, fearing to miss the moment of the historical collapse of the German front. However, behind the facade of rapid advance lay an alarming reality that they tried not to notice in those days. Soviet tank corps, having covered hundreds of kilometers in battle, resembled shadows of their former selves. In some units, instead of the prescribed 200 tanks, only 10 to 15 serviceable vehicles remained. The rear was catastrophically lagging behind. Fuel trucks got stuck in deep snow in the beginning of the thaw, and the railways were so destroyed that supplies were delivered literally by hand and horse-drawn transport. Soldiers slept 2 to 3 hours a day, subsisting on hardtack and concentrates, but the belief in the proximity of victory replaced both food and rest for them. The distance between the advancing units and supply bases increased to 300 and sometimes 400 kilometers. Communication lines were stretched like the finest strings, ready to snap at the slightest touch. But in the headquarters of the Voronezh and southwestern fronts, maps continued to be colored with red arrows, extending far beyond the horizon. At the very same time, on the other end of the invisible front, at the headquarters of Army Group South in Zaporizhia, a man with a cold, analytical mind was preparing a countermove. Erich von Manstein, one of the Wehrmacht's most capable strategists, perfectly understood that direct resistance to the Soviet steamroller was now impossible. He observed how Soviet troops were biting deeper and deeper into the void created by his deliberate retreat. Manstein consciously abandoned cities and territories, shortening his front line and gathering into a fist what remained of his divisions. And most importantly, newly arrived elite units. For him, Kharkiv was not a goal, but a bait. He allowed Soviet troops to take the city, allowed them to believe in the weakness of his resistance, in order to strike, quote, one at the right moment. Hitler, furiously demanding to hold every meter of land, flew to Zaporizhia on February 19th, ready to remove Manstein from his post. However, the cannonade of Soviet guns, already audible on the outskirts of the city, convinced him to trust the field marshal's plan. The external conflict of this battle unfolded according to the classic canons of military drama. By mid-February 1943, the Soviet offensive had reached its peak. The 25th Tank Corps was only a few tens of kilometers from Zaporizhia, where Manstein's headquarters was located. The situation seemed catastrophic for the German side, but it was at this moment that the effect of overstretching forces manifested itself. Soviet divisions stretched over a vast area lost contact with each other. Troop groupings turned into scattered islands floating across the boundless snowy ocean. Manstein, on the other hand, consolidated his forces. He created a unique fist from the SS Panzer Corps, which included the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions. These units were fully equipped with new technology, including heavy Tiger tanks, which became an unpleasant surprise for Soviet tank crews. On February 19, 1943, the situation began to change rapidly. While Vatutin reported to Stalin that the enemy was hastily retreating across the Dnieper, German tank wedges began to cut through the flanks of the advancing Soviet Sixth Army. The blow was not delivered head-on, but along converging directions, in the very places where Soviet rear areas were most vulnerable. The surprise was absolute. Soviet units, accustomed in recent weeks only to pursuing a retreating enemy, suddenly found themselves being encircled. Communication between headquarters and units began to collapse. Commanders on the ground could not believe what was happening, considering enemy counterattacks to be merely local incidents. But this was not a local counterattack, but a full-scale strategic offensive. The internal conflict of this period lay in the clash of psychologies. On one side, Soviet generals intoxicated by the Stalingrad success. For Golikov and Vatutin, any attempt at caution seemed like a manifestation of weakness or indecision in the face of Stalin, who demanded results here and now. They were hostages of their own system, where initiative was often punished and aggressiveness was encouraged above all else. Their personal drama lay in their inability to acknowledge the obvious. Their troops were exhausted to the limit. They saw not living people on the maps, but arrows and circles, ignoring reports of empty fuel tanks and jammed guns. This was pride, elevated to the rank of state policy. Each of them wanted to be the hero who would finish off the enemy in his lair, and this desire clouded their judgment. On the other side stood Manstein, whose inner world was governed by iron logic and professional cynicism. He risked everything, his career, honor, and possibly his life, when he went against the will of the Führer, temporarily abandoning Kharkov. His personal conflict with Hitler was no less acute than the battle on the fields of Ukraine. Manstein understood that time was working against him, and the only chance was to wait for the moment when Soviet power would turn into weakness due to its own inertia. This was the cold calculation of a gambler who stakes his last coin, knowing that the opponent is already too confident in his victory to notice the catch. He felt no euphoria, only dry satisfaction that his mathematical calculation was beginning to pay off. The philosophical layer of this confrontation lies in the clash of two military concepts: the strategy of total offense and the doctrine of elastic defense. Soviet military thought of that time, inspired by the ideas of deep operation, sought an endless development of success. This was a belief in the unstoppable force of an idea and a mass that should sweep away any obstacles. However, the Kharkov tragedy showed that even the highest motivation is powerless before the laws of logistics and spatio-temporal factors. This was a lesson that war is not only heroism, but also a precise calculation of resources. The conflict of values manifested itself in how human life was sacrificed for the sake of the pace of the offensive. On the German side, elastic defense became the highest manifestation of tactical skill, aimed at preserving one's forces while maximally exhausting the enemy. The paradox was that the side that ultimately lost the war demonstrated a more flexible and modern understanding of warfare in a crisis at this particular moment. The transformation of events occurred in the last days of February. The weather, that eternal companion of all wars, suddenly changed the rules of the game. The ensuing thaw turned the roads into an impassable mess of mud and melted snow. For Soviet troops, deprived of normal supplies, this became a death sentence. Heavy T-34 and KV tanks got stuck in the black soil, becoming easy prey for German aviation and long-range artillery. By February 25th, it became clear that the front was collapsing. The Soviet Sixth Army was encircled. Popov's group, which was supposed to be the core of the offensive on Mariupol, was almost completely destroyed. Now it was no longer Soviet troops pursuing the enemy, but the remnants of divisions trying to break through to the east, leaving behind equipment on the roadside that had held all hopes just a week earlier. The situation around Kharkov became critical by early March 1943. The city, which had been so triumphantly liberated just 2 weeks earlier, was again under threat. The command of the Voronezh front tried to organize a defense, but there were practically no fresh forces left. The last reserves were thrown into battle, including the remnants of tank brigades and Ludvík Svoboda's Czechoslovak battalion, which fought its first battle near the village of Sokolovo. The courage of the soldiers was unparalleled, but it could not compensate for the strategic mistakes of the high command. The enemy advanced from the north and west, methodically tightening the ring around the city. By March 10th, the fighting had moved to the outskirts of Kharkov. The culmination of the battle unfolded on the streets of the city itself. These were 4 days of hell. From the 11th to the 15th of March, fighting raged for every house, for every intersection. General Rybalko's Soviet Third Tank Army, trapped in the city blocks, fought in complete isolation. Tanks became vulnerable in narrow alleys, and a shortage of ammunition forced soldiers into hand-to-hand combat. German SS units, using their superiority in firepower and air support, literally gnawed through the defenses. By March 15th, it became clear that holding the city would only lead to the complete loss of all remaining troops. The order to retreat was given. The last units left Kharkov at night, breaking through enemy cordons. The city once again plunged into the shadow of occupation, and the snow on its streets turned crimson from the spilled blood of those who so sincerely believed in the swift end of the war. After the battle's conclusion, the front stabilized along the Seversky Donets River. The ensuing pause allowed both sides to lick their wounds and comprehend what had happened. For the Soviet leadership, it was a cold shower. It turned out that the enemy was still very strong, and its command was capable of audacious and effective operations. The losses were enormous: tens of thousands of fallen soldiers, hundreds of lost tanks and artillery pieces. But the most painful was the psychological blow. The belief that after Stalingrad victory would be easy and swift evaporated. It was here, in the snows near Kharkov, that the caution and meticulous planning were forged, which would later become the key to success at the Kursk salient. The resonance of this battle in history turned out to be paradoxical. In Soviet official historiography, the Third Battle of Kharkov long remained in the shadows. It was preferred to mention it only in passing, as a temporary setback or frontline stabilization. The brilliant victories at Stalingrad and the subsequent triumph at the Kursk salient served as convenient frameworks that allowed this painful failure to be concealed. However, ignoring such lessons always comes at a high price. The Kharkov catastrophe of March 43rd teaches us that success is the most dangerous teacher. It blinds, deprives of vigilance, and makes one mistake wishful thinking for reality. In the modern world where the pace of decision-making and information flows have increased manifold, this lesson is more relevant than ever. The illusion of final victory in any sphere, political, economic, or personal, often becomes a prelude to the deepest fall. This battle also highlighted a fundamental problem of the human factor in a large system. When leaders in the upper echelons of power stop hearing the voice of reality coming from below, the system is doomed to crisis. Reports of minor difficulties, substituting for information about catastrophe, led to the demise of entire armies. This is a universal truth. Honesty with oneself and the ability to admit mistakes at the moment they are made are the only insurance against a major tragedy. The heroism of ordinary soldiers often becomes merely an attempt to close gaps created by the criminal arrogance of those who control their destinies. We must remember this not only for the sake of historical justice, but also to understand the mechanisms of today's conflicts and crises. The significance of the Kharkov events of 1943 goes beyond military memoirs. This is a story about the limits of human and technical capabilities. It is a reminder that any force has its point of exhaustion. Manstein, delivering his sweeping blow, could not change the outcome of the war, but he managed to demonstrate that even in the most hopeless situation, professionalism and cold calculation can work wonders. At the same time, the Soviet side gained invaluable, albeit bitter, experience. It was after Kharkov that Stalin began to trust the opinions of his generals more, such as Zhukov and Vasilevsky, who insisted on deep defense and thorough preparation for future operations. The slap from the Wehrmacht sobered the command and forced it to mature. Today, looking at the panorama of modern Kharkiv, it is difficult to imagine those dramatic events. The city lives its own life, its past wounds healed. But if you look closely at the old buildings, still bearing the traces of shrapnel, you can feel the echo of that February and March. It is a reminder of how thin the line is between triumph and catastrophe. The history of the Third Battle of Kharkiv is not only a chronicle of losses and tactical maneuvers, it is a deep reflection on human nature, on pride and humility, on faith and disappointment. It teaches us that true victory requires not only strength, but also wisdom, not only assault, but also patience. Returning to that February day in 1943, when the first Soviet tanks entered Dzerzhinsky Square, we see not just soldiers, but people seized by a great dream of peace. Their joy was sincere, their hopes justified by their own feat. What happened later does not diminish their heroism, but places on us the responsibility to remember the truth in its entirety. The tragedy near Kharkiv was part of that long and agonizing path that ultimately led to May of '45. The snow that covered the tracks of retreating columns in March of '43 concealed many details, but it could not erase the memory of the price paid for understanding reality. We look at these events through the prism of decades, understanding that each such episode is an important brick in the foundation of our shared historical memory. Concluding this journey along the snowy roads of 43, we again find ourselves at the broken window of Gazprom. The wind still howls through its empty eye sockets, but now it is the wind of history, bringing to us the voices of those who did not return from that spring offensive. We understand that the lessons of Kharkiv are not just paragraphs in tactical textbooks. They are eternal truths that behind every great achievement lies the need for a sober view of the world, and behind every mistake, the opportunity to become stronger and wiser. History does not forgive forgetfulness, but it always gives a chance to those who are willing to learn from its painful but necessary lessons. And as long as we remember this ringing slap in the face, we are insured against repeating it again and again in the future. The evening sun of 1943 slowly set behind the horizon, painting the sky in the same tones as the reflections of fires on the city's outskirts. Kharkiv fell silent, preparing for a new stage of its trial. And somewhere far away in the headquarters, they were already poring over new maps, which did not yet show the Kursk bulge. But the understanding was already maturing that the next battle had to be won not only with heart, but also with mind. The life cycle of this great and terrible event concluded to give rise to a new, even more massive act of human history, in which there would no longer be room for previous carelessness.